The term Reverend?
Yeah, the term or the title Reverend, for those of us Moors, we understand what titles of nobility are. I didn't get the title of Reverend first from seeking it in a church or from a church organization. The title Reverend actually came as a result of my dealing, the way I speak, the way I tend to elaborate and get into the kind of preachiness. So a lot of times the audience that I would speak to earlier in my Heal Thyself days would say, "You go ahead, Reverend." So the title stuck. It was not a title of nobility. It was more like a title of endearment. And it stuck. So earlier in my youth, I had these designs to be a doctor, and I was actually going to be going to medical school, and I got sidetracked to do music. So as I was sidetracked to do music, I was actually doing medicine, reading books that had to do with natural healing, with metaphysics, while I was on the road with my band. And as my music began to peter out, which is a whole other story, it could take up a whole other set of tapes, I began to become more serious about this natural healing, because I was afflicted with asthma and slight cases of angina. And my asthma had gotten so bad that I had promised that, all the ancestors, that if I could find a healer, or I could find any way to heal myself, I would then teach other people how to do that. And this happened when I was in the street trying to catch my breath based upon my asthma. Well, I did find a place. It was called here, the University at the corner of Lenox Avenue, the Tree of Life, which at the time was run by Brother Kanya Vashon McGee. At the time he was called Kanya Kakumba. And what happened was I began to study and get into rational fasting by Arnold Earhart, and Dick Gregory's books on natural healing. And from that point on, I began to do my healing, and then I said, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm saying all of this to come around to the reason how I got Reverend was that I found out that you either had to be a doctor licensed by the state in order to touch people for the purpose of healing them, or you could become a minister in a church, which also gave quote-unquote license to touch a person, or to lay on of hands to do healing. At that point, I began to recalibrate the rules and regulations, the protocols of a church organization, and did my healing based upon being a minister, and the religion was actually health. So from that point, I began to deal with trying to find a way to become, I guess, a minister of health with a religious tip. So I became ordained in a church in California, and I actually incorporated at the time, a church called the Temple of the Healing Spirit, Self-Healing Education Center, Temple of Ma'at, which became the Institute for Self-Mastery. And I incorporated it under the articles that this particular church organization believed that health and the temple of God, which is the human body, should not put poisons, yada, yada, yada. One day I'll show you what that's about. It's called the Vedamikam of Temple Beliefs and Policies. And I became actually a reverend whose church and whose religion was centered around the resurrection of higher spiritual evolution through the learning and the teaching and the doctrines of health. So Reverend stuck. It became an actual title, but a title based on agnostic, based on nothing to do with Christianity as taught by the Orthodox Church, but Christianity as interpreted or properly interpreted through the Pertem Haru, which is the book of coming forth by day, and all the other ancient Kemetic information and historical data that actually led to the build-up and the creation of what they call the Bible.
Okay, now, what are the time frames from the very beginning of when you decided to move into the metaphysical, or actually the health part of your life, studying health, and then on to metaphysics? And who were some of the people that you came in contact with and had to deal with as far as healing and otherwise?
Good question. It was in the late 70s, going into the 80s, that my music began to peter out based on poor management. I mean, we opened up for some of the top acts. I mean, James Brown, Larry Graham, you know, we had all the top acts that we opened up for. And at the time, we were ready to make a quantum leap into the music business, but one thing led to the next. And I began to put that aside and began to truly pick up and look into this thing of natural healing. And I began meeting people along the way. I met, of course, Kanya McGee. I also met Dr. John Moore, who was a herbologist, who essentially turned out to be my teacher in herbology. And I studied with Kanya. I actually studied herbology with my Hobia teacher in Trinidad when I was very young, so it wasn't new to make the transition. At the time, he and I, we clicked. That was the time when Helen Robinson / Afua, now Queen Afua, and I began to get together to build an organization, or to support the evolution of an organization that she had began called Heal Thyself. At the time, I had a small organization called the Children of Thoth, the Children of Jehudi, where I taught metaphysics, meditation, and natural health from my space. And when we came together, I met with Helen at that time, and I'll speak in the past, and she began to introduce me to members of the cultural community. I was mostly in the entertainment field at that time, / cultural community. And the people that I knew from that was actually based on the Hollywood set and the place where people did their music in the studios. And she was more into the deep cultural community. And when she and I came together, I became more infused into the deeper cultural community. So I met with Baba Ishangi, I met with Dr. Moore, I met with, I met Kanya by myself. I met with Lloyd Strayhorn, the numerologist, and a brother named Yusef Pollack, who used to be part of it. And then I also met with Brother John Harris, and became very close with that brother. And that circle began to influence me. They were just kicking into that natural healing / metaphysics / ancient mystery system. And it felt very comfortable to me because I was studying on my own at the time, since I was 19 years of age. I used to visit the Theosophy Lodge on 72nd Street, one of the only few people of color that was actually going to that place at the time. And it became one large mosaic from that point. And when Afua and I, or Helen and I, came together to build Heal Thyself on Nostrand Avenue, she had just left, I believe, Flatbush Avenue, and opened up that new place called Heal Thyself on Nostrand, with the help of a good brother, I have to remember his name and come back to it again, who taught us, ancient Chinese medicine. Brother James Wilson, Dr. James Wilson. Dr. James Wilson and Helen had started to build or rebuild her version of the Heal Thyself at that point. And she was just getting started, getting into that part of the community. And she and I met at one of, I believe, John Harris's, or one of, I think it was Kanye's, and John Harris had helped to sponsor a psychic fair, and a holistic health fair. And she was there, and I was working at the time through the Tree of Life as kind of an adjunct teacher. And she and I met, and we came together, I guess, back in the early 80s. I believe it was in the 80 or 81. You know, if you get the information, you know, correct me. And she and I began to come together to build on something based on our two respective experiences. And from that point, I began to go into the community. She began introducing me to the people in the community. And I just went out, and she and I went out, and we began kicking this natural healing thing live. We were aggressive in trying to get our people to know that there was a better way than this drugs and these surgeries that they were suffering from. And then from that, my being out in the street pushing natural healing, I got to meet with a wonderful sister. Her name was Harriet. And she ran with her husband a place on Nostrand Avenue and Eastern Parkway, first black bodybuilding institution that I ever saw. And that bodybuilding institution, I think it was called Heavenly Bodies at the time. It was right there on the corner of Nostrand Avenue and Eastern Parkway. And I met with her. I went up into the place to try to pass out my flyers, and I met Harriet.
I just want to change position.
Where was I? Distraction.
Maybe that was
Yeah, hang on. No, wait, let me finish this thought. I believe we were.
You had.
So I went up to pass out flyers at this place called Heavenly Bodies on Eastern Parkway. And as I went up the stairs, I saw all these buff, you know, beautifully chiseled brothers and sisters were up there, and there in the middle was this sister with this huge smile, just welcoming everybody, very happy, and that was Harriet. And Harriet, I don't remember her new name. She had gotten changed. She's changed her name now. But Harriet Martin was her name. She welcomed us in. She welcomed me in. And I came and I was giving out flyers. She looked at the flyers. She said, "Oh, I've been looking for a place like this, and the colonics and the cleansing and so forth." I said, "Well, we're right down the block, and we've been looking for a place like you." So one thing led to the next, and we got to know Harriet. Harriet now knew someone who would help us to become more known in the community, and through Harriet Martin, we got to meet Gary Bird. Gary Bird was living at Harriet Martin's home in Manhattan at the towers down by, right next door to Manhattan College, Borough Manhattan Community College. And Gary was living temporarily in her apartment because he was moving from where he was to try to find an apartment, and he was staying at her apartment. And she introduced us to Gary, and I met with Gary, and Gary came down to the Heal Thyself Center and got his first colonic and his first purification program, and it became a beautiful synergy, because at that point Gary invited us onto his program, the GBE Experience, and from there we began to rock Harlem and New York City with what turned out to be, for the African American, black, you know, melanated community, a whole new outlook for the approach to health. Now, it isn't that we were the first ones doing this, because there was Sister Daya, and there were other black organizations that were doing this, but I believe that Heal Thyself began to popularize it and take it to a wider range of peoples of color, and we became pretty much synonymous with natural healing. And from that, we began to interface more, and more people began to know about more of the available natural healing services that were around them in the community. So Heal Thyself became the spark for what natural healing was going to be. And through that organization, we began to introduce metaphysics, because I used to teach metaphysics once every 7 months. Those numbers were very important. And metaphysics became the in thing and a very quiet and small part of the community. We mixed metaphysics with the cultural part of it through Baba Ishangi. And Baba Ishangi used to come and teach us ancient African rituals, and we used to drum in there. We had Mudabaruka used to come through there, and we had some of the top name peoples that came through at that time were becoming more and more open and aware that natural healing was going to be the only way for us to actually help to regenerate our people. But it became beautiful because more people began to know that fasting and purification, cleansing, and the ancient ways that our ancestors did to heal themselves was the way. My mother said, you're going to go poor and broke trying to get black people to stop eating. But I did, at the time, it became a thing where I said, well, I believe that this is the way. I believe that I could teach people, because one more thing, just to be in retrospect, when I was convalescing, I want to give props and praises to my blessed parents, especially my mother, for allowing me to stay when I lost my other apartment, to stay at the home and to convalesce when I was very sick, to go through and experiment on this thing, fasting and purification, because at one time I fasted for 52 days, another year I fasted 46 days. I mean, I was out to lunch. My beard was down to here, my hair was down to my backside, so I was like going around, and people would cross the street when they'd see me, So I was in this place where I was going to become self-aware and the whole 9 yards, and experimenting with these things I was actually investigating and researching. And one thing led to the next, where I would be sitting on my porch from 6 o'clock in the morning after doing my sunrise meditation, and I would have on my porch, I would have literally 50, 60 books that I would be reading and referring to. And people would be going to work. And there would be friends of ours on the block, and I would be saying, hi, how you doing? And they'd tell me, oh, I got this backache and this back pain. And then they would tell me, oh, I have this headache, or I got this cold. And I would say, well, try this, try this, try this. And people would come back maybe a week later saying, hey, that was pretty good. What you're telling me? So I said, hey, it works. It's real. So I began to do it actually for real when I began to put out by word of mouth to brothers and sisters in the musical and the movie industry who were into into entertainment, that I was available to help them, to counsel them. So one thing led to the next when I met Afua, and you got the story behind that.
Okay. Checking that mic.
Yeah, I have it as close as I can.
Okay, no, it's good.
It's good?
Yeah. Okay.
Funny, I was born in the Bronx. Yeah, they said, whoa, you born in the Bronx? Yeah, I was born in the Bronx at Lincoln Hospital. My mother had come from Trinidad to study nursing. She was pregnant with me at the time. My father, bless his soul, I'm thinking of him right now, he was in Korea in the war. And that's a whole other traumatic story based upon what it did to him. And I was born in Lincoln Hospital, approximately 9:55 in the morning, but I'm not going to tell you when. And I have been, I've been really searching out what that whole experience was, because from the time I was about 2 or 3, I used to live down in Brooklyn, in Fort Greene. That was where my parents lived at the time. And because of the economic constraints, my parents sent me, or my mother sent me, to live with my father's mother and father. And in the West Indies, I was living in the bush, actually. Back in those days, it was pristine, it was beautiful. We lived next to a swamp. I actually saw gators. I mean, every child should live somewhere where it's wild and it's nothing but nature. At that point, I learned that nature was a living thing, because I was actually raised not only by my grandparents, but an Obeah man. And this Obeah man lived in the swamps, had a place carved out for himself, and he taught myself and another young Dravidian boy, Indian boy, who lived at the in Mayaro at the time we lived. And I slept in the trees. I learned to communicate with animals. I saw phenomenal things that at that age, if you see it, you could only think that a Steven Spielberg might have set up the special effects for them. I learned certain things, and I was told I had the gift to see certain things. And, I lived in that kind of environment. I've watched nature. And then from that point, my mother came and got us and took us back here from the West Indies. And it was like culture shock, because I came from bush to live in the concrete. And it was like, whew, people were strange. The people here were strange. I was 2 or 3 grades ahead of the education system. So instead of putting me up where I would have supposed to have been, they put me back a grade because my age matched the place where I was supposed to be. And I got really tired, really bored with school, and did it automatically. And got very high marks, and said to hell with it after a while, and went to college, dropped out of college, and pursued music. There was no love for the system. I was raised a Catholic, and everybody who's raised a Catholic knows that once you get out of Catholic school, it's like parole. And I think that being raised a Catholic really gave me an appreciation of the knowledge of how our peoples were thoroughly brainwashed and totally fucked up over the years of indoctrination by the British, French, Portuguese. And I was fortunate to have raised a Catholic so that my arguments against Christianity come from a first-hand experience, a knowledge of what goes on in the Catholic schools and the Catholic system. Mind you, I did get a quote-unquote good education. I learned to read very well, which was a boon. And if there's nothing else that you go to school to, I say to those brothers and sisters, young ones who come here, to learn to read the basics, because after that you could teach yourself. With enough tenacity and enough patience, you can teach yourself. I don't know what happened after I got here, because everything was a blank. I know that school was a pain in the ass. I know that I felt like I was ahead or above pretty much everything they were pushing at me. But I broke away. I studied what I wanted to study rather than what I had to study. And that led me to this place now. It gave me a whole other slant on the information. What I thought was something that was personal and just self-serving turned out to be where everybody who went through the normal channels of school ended up wanting to come. So what I was forced to do, and I teach that to most of the brothers and sisters who are out there, if you have a calling to study or to be something outside of the norm and you're being persecuted for it, somehow you don't find a place or a niche for it, know that you are before your time, and that sometimes you are being given instructions from a school where there are only few students, and this school can only be reached when you go to sleep, when you're in deep meditation, when you get into a metaphysical frame of mind. You are guided from authorities that cannot be verified by the mundane or the average human being. And those people are the ones who are going to set the stage for humanity's whole shift into a new paradigm. So if you feel you're strange, know that you're out of time today, but you're in time and in step with tomorrow. My personal feelings is that there's no place, like they say, like New York. Every place I've traveled is trying to be New York. New York is the center. This is where everybody from around the world first comes when they reach North America. They have to channel through this one port. The fact that our ancestors were sold, murdered, killed, raped here, and became the economic foundation to this country here from this point, the fact that our slave labor built these opportunities that everybody who came in and said they started with nothing, they started with a hell of a lot more. They started with their own freedom. And they started from a place where they got the dignity based upon what it is that we created of this land. I empathize also with those of my ancestry who were the Native Americans and what it is that we suffered as well in this diaspora. But my personal feelings of New York is one of a kind of a guarded love. I have a kind of a reserved apathy. It could change at any time. I get excited when I leave it, coming back, and I can't wait to leave it when I'm getting out of here. It's a mixed emotion. It's like a family member that you're going to miss, but when you're around it too much, you got to get away from them. New York from the time of Malcolm has been the center, the focus, the synapse of all consciousness elevation that disseminates itself outward throughout this Western Hemisphere. New York, to me, has been you can't mess around when you're in New York. The people in New York are so oversaturated with stimulus from every sector, from every possible activity of human endeavor is here in New York. So we have been exposed to everything. Nobody can come with anything new in New York. That's why if you want to impress the brothers and sisters in New York, you got to be coming with your heavy ballistics. You cannot bullshit. That's why very few speakers in the specific field that we're in can actually make it here in New York and keep a faithful audience coming back and forth, because you got to hit them with things that they're not ready to hear, or they want to hear it but they've never heard it before. They've studied deep but they haven't heard the information quite put this way before. You can't mess around. You can't bullshit with people in New York, because this is where the masters actually have come to set up shop. And I'm very thankful to have been selected to have been one of the first people to actually introduce metaphysics on the scale that it has been received and introduced here today. I remember back in the days when Heal Thyself in the early 80s, in the early 70s, late 70s, early 80s, when my specific temple and that temple were trying to get people to think outside of the box, think outside of the constraints, the ceiling, the walls. And it became a lesson that on me, because what I understood, I didn't understand that they did not understand. And one day I had an elderly brother who came to one of my metaphysics class, and he says, "Brother, you got some heavy stuff you're talking here, very heavy." He says, "But you're talking to yourself." And I didn't understand what the brother said. "You're talking to yourself because you understand what you're talking about." He said, a good teacher, and this is why I listen to my elders, he said, a good teacher knows how to make simple something that is very complicated. He knows how to factor it down, diagram the sentence in such a way that average people get it just like that. So that had become my quest. How do I diagram the higher principles of metaphysics so that the average man and woman can benefit from it? In other words, practical metaphysics, applicable metaphysics. And that is what I have actually based my focus, my attention on, trying to get the people to love metaphysics the way I love it, by spoon-feeding them first and then bringing them before the banquet as they begin to grow and become stronger in it. Again, back to New York, with Malcolm, with Brother Khalid Muhammad, with the Million Youth March, with all of the attempts that Brother Marcus Garvey, when and what's his name, from the Honorable Haile Selassie. There was a great dynamism to Harlem, to this part of New York. There's a vortex right here that whites know exist, and that was created by us. We put the spiritual energy in this place, which has now died because they've done their best to help us, to tell us to go ahead, show us we can go ahead and build this up, we'll give it to you, you got it. But then all of a sudden they pull the rug from under you, and what you have is this lingering power that is just waiting to be sucked up by those who now come in and assume control based upon the ability they have, the fact that they have the currency and the finance to do these things. So I weep now for Harlem because I see what's becoming of it. Before it was a thriving place. They had their criminals, they had their Nicky Barnes, we had our Nicky Barnes, we had we had every element. We had superstars, we had our Joe Louis, we had everybody. But I'm weeping now because we don't have any more heroes. We don't have any more. We have Clinton coming up here, and now he's the superhero. You know, when my brother Khalid was eliminated and assassinated, now we don't have anybody that walks the streets, that have crowds around them like we used to have. Celebrity. And we know that because that celebrity, the brothers and sisters, whoever they were doing something to make us proud. Now they have castrated most of our black leaders who walk around here working and dealing with the boule and these other black organizations of elitist jigaboo Negroes. They have now sold us out. We don't have the same spirit. There isn't the same concern for one another, and that's going to have to change. Prayerfully, the younger brothers and sisters who are seeing this, who are out there searching for the dynamics, the metaphysics, the spiritual energy, the cultural energy, our story, their history. We get those brothers and sisters working, and we may be able to rebuild and to have a new Harlem Renaissance. Whoa, what is it that keeps me going? Well, once you realize that you're on assignment spiritually, once you understand why it is that the human temple was actually created, you get a sense of yourself and you know that it's a duty, it's a love that you have for your people, regardless. Dr. John Moore, the late Dr. John Moore, said, the hardest thing to do is to work for your own people, because it's thankless, you don't get paid, and if you do, it's just barely to get by. There is no, I guess, across the board popularity, because us as a people, we're so diversely fragmented based upon how we've been educated and separated and mind-fucked by Willie Lynchism. We do not have the cohesiveness that brought us together during what was called the Civil Rights Movement. We don't have the same cohesiveness that brought us together during the Black Star Movement. We don't have the same cohesiveness that we used to have in the Nation of Islam. But what keeps me going is the fact that I find out something new every day about myself. And there's something different for me to involve myself with myself. Some people become very lonely, and the reason most people become lonely is because they have not yet found out who they are so that they could fall in love with that part of themselves. This is not, self-aggrandizement, narcissism, whatever you want to call it. It's a love of who, the ancestors bequeathed you. That melanin trail that leads back to Africa, which from Africa leads to the Sirius star system. It's knowing that you have an ancient heritage, not only an earth heritage, but a star heritage. And that when you're here and you're teaching and you're benefiting yourself and evolving as well as helping others, that's a quest that people dream for. If I had my whole life to live over again, would I do it the same way? Yeah, I would do it the same way. Why? Because I've learned so much from so many diverse activities that I've participated in. There is no downtime. People who are stuck in a 9-to-5 can't possibly evolve when they have that weight on them. I'm not saying everybody just jump ship and get rid of your 9-to-5, but people who have 9-to-5 jobs cannot see their development. In fact, they feel as if they've gotten stuck in a space and place that has them regressing. And they yearn to be free of it, though they know that they need it based on their life conditions and circumstances. I have been blessed to have worked hard enough, had many of those downtimes when I went without eating, so learning how not to eat became an advantage. I learned many different things that helped me to help others, so that now when people come to me, when medical science and the rest of it just fails, as it normally would, I can eke out a living by helping people help themselves. And the problem with me being in this business is that I can't get rich from it. And the blessing in this business is that I can't get rich from it.